Okay, sociology class, welcome to your very first online video lecture concerning our second chapter on culture. The definition of culture is knowledge, values, customs, and objects that are shared by a society. And so these would be things of interest for a sociologist to study. And since you're taking this class in America, some of these items may be familiar to you as part of what we would consider the American culture. That's different from a society. When we say society, like the American society, we're actually talking about the specific territory inhabited by the people. And so the American society would actually be the physical area that all of us inhabit. And when we talk about the American culture, we're talking about those ideas, objects, and beliefs. So let's look at culture here. A culture trait is going to be a single object, action, or belief, which are interesting to study, but oftentimes sociologists like to study these sets of interrelated traits that we would call a culture complex. A great example of this is eating dinner. We could look at the individual traits of anywhere from silverware to manners at the table to how much food is appropriate or inappropriate to eat at a meal on an individual level, on a trait by trait basis. But it's probably more interesting to study how all of those things relate to one another in the complex known as eating dinner in the American culture. Concerning those beliefs and objects, some further distinctions here is that we can usually divide them up into two things. Non material culture will be the abstract ideas or the beliefs. Think the non tangible things, the things you can't actually touch or see. And so beliefs are just ideas about the nature of reality, and knowledge is going to actually be attempts to define what exists or the reality of the world. So, what we know as truth and what we believe together make up non material culture. The things of our culture are going to be organized into the grouping known as material culture, right? Concrete, tangible items of a culture. Concerning culture, we can also study culture in terms of ideal versus real culture. Okay, ideal culture are the guidelines that we accept to be true, whereas real culture is the actual behavior of members of a group. And so you can probably think of lots of times when, for example, lying, the cultural guideline would be to never lie, but in real culture, there may be instances where members of the group engage in that behavior. There might be more appropriate times to bend that rule than others. So that would be something else that a sociologist would be interested in studying. A little distinction here, values would still be part of our non material culture. They're broad ideas about what's good or desirable. Okay, and cultural values is just the collection. Like, what does America as a society and as a culture value? That's something that we'll discuss later on in this chapter. Norms are going to be part of our non material culture as well. Norms are going to be the rules that define appropriate and inappropriate behavior. Okay, and there are some different examples of norms. Okay, a folkway is going to be a norm that lacks moral significance. So think of this as just a preference for how our culture would want somebody to act. Okay, but it's not going to be life or death if you don't follow a folkway. A moray, it looks like Moors, but it's pronounced moray. Those are norms with moral dimensions. So those for sure are going to be ones that the culture wants its members to follow. Taboo is going to be a norm that's so strong. Actually, a taboo would be a moray that's so strong that violation would demand very harsh, strong punishment. And obviously, a lot of our mores and taboos are formally defined in the form of a law, right? Which would just mean it's a norm that's enforced by officials. Okay, so a little practice here for you. You don't necessarily need to write this slide down, but let's just see based on what you know, right? Which type of norm is being violated? Oh, look, a cute little baby. Having a baby before marriage. This would be something that would be interesting for sociologists to discuss. I think at one time in our culture, this was very taboo. Is it viewed as immoral by the American culture now? I'm not so sure. I think this one would be up for debate. So, what do you think, folkway or moray? I'm not sure there is a right answer on that example. Speeding, we know that speeding is against the law. So what the rule or the norm of engaging in safe driving to protect yourself and fellow members of your culture is so important to us that we've put it into law, and it can be enforced by officials. Okay. Wearing too much makeup, while not the best thing, it's more of a folk way, right? I don't think any strong punishment comes from violating this norm. And then finally, marriage here. How about marrying your sibling? Now that sounds great, right? That one is the one that made you cringe, so definitely a taboo. Okay, so hopefully those examples give you an idea of what we mean when we talk about the different types of norms. Okay, so how do we enforce these rules? Well, obviously, we talked about laws being enforced by some sort of official in the culture, but sanctions are just what we call rewards or punishments that the culture uses to encourage people to follow their norms. And sanctions can come in two different forms. You can give formal sanctions, which are imposed by persons given special authority. So, in the example of our different types of norms, laws are going to fall under the guise of formal sanctions. But you also have informal sanctions, which can be applied by most members of the group. And so if you think about if we pretend like Perry High School is a culture in and of itself, we're our own little society, and we talk about dress code violations, right? Formal sanctions would be, teachers or administrators assigning detentions or AEP for violations of the dress code. But informal sanctions can happen as well. Like if a young woman was scantily clad, she may be sent to the office for her short skirt, or she may be heckled in the hallway by her peers. That's an informal sanction. Either way you slice it, right? It's a punishment that encourages her to follow the proper dress code. It just depends on who is doing the sanctioning, on whether or not it's formal or informal. Okay. A little more talk on culture. You're almost there. Symbols and language, right? Remember the perspectives in sociology. The symbolic interactionist perspective is highly interested in studying this element of culture. But symbols are going to be a thing that stands for or represents something else, right? And both spoken language, signed language, nonverbals can all be a part of this. And so the American flag is a great example of a symbol that represents our culture and our society, right? But informal, gestures such as, the classic, Eskimo kiss, or even a handshake or a hug, right? All of those things would be ways that we could communicate in our culture, and so they would count as symbols in language. All right. Even though we talk about the American culture as a single entity, we still have some differentiation even within cultures, and so sociologists like to study that as well. Universals are going to be features that are common in all cultures, right? And so you're going to find some universal norms or mores that most cultures tend to follow. Don't kill people, you should tell the truth, right? It's hard to get along as a group of people unless you have some foundations established on what's appropriate and inappropriate. But we do have differences amongst things as well. And our diversity is usually represented with subcultures, which are people who follow a culture but just have some values and norms that are unique to their group. And some subcultures would be labeled as countercultures. Those are subcultures that have rejected the norms of the culture. And so let's play a game: counterculture or subculture, right? The punk there at the bottom right hand side, probably more of a subculture, right? Individuals living in Chinatown in a large city, right, are still subscribing to the American culture and values, but are retaining some of their own traditional values from the culture, in which they emigrated from. And that would probably still be considered a subculture. The Amish, believe it or not, they don't appear to look rebellious to you, but would probably be labeled as a counterculture in that they have rejected a lot of the norms of the American culture and a lot of the rules in favor of their subculture's own rules. And so there's some different examples of counterculture and subculture for you. And so please, bring your notes with you to class. We're going to do some examples in class, and let me know if you have any questions or concerns.